If you didn't do it before, you need to fit your rear main seal mount past the engine stand adapter and seal and bolt it in place. If you can't get the seal adapter past the engine stand adapter, you need to get the block out of the stand and onto the ground. If you don't have an engine hoist handy, the block and crank are not too heavy for two strong people to lower by hand. Pick up the block in the stand first to be sure that you can both handle the weight. If you feel comfortable, slide it out and lower it. When you can get to it, clean and seal both the block and adapter. Then seal and stick the gasket in place. Once the adapter is bolted on, fit your engine stand adapter to the block and get it back into the stand. Picking it up is harder. Get 3 or even 4 helpers if 2 of you aren't comfortable with the weight. Only lift with your knees.
Before we cover up this area with the oil pan, we need to take care of a few things. First up is to torque the rod bolts. Have your crank turning tool installed and rotate the first rod journal up. Set your torque wrench to the first of the 3 increments. Torque all 4 of the bolts for the first rod journal. Set the wrench to the second increment and torque them again. Then set the wrench to the third and final setting and torque all 4 of these bolts. Rotate the crank so the next rod journal is facing up, and then go through the 3 increments to reach your final torque setting on all of the rod bolts there. After you've done all the rod journals, leave your wrench on the final setting and go through every bolt once more just to be sure. If you miss any of them right now, you're not going to be able to go back and check once you've got the oil pan installed. Next up will be the oil pump. If you have a press-on pickup like this, make sure that the marks that you made earlier in pre-assembly are all still lined up. Then, if your pump uses some kind of collar to hold the drive shaft on, you'll want to install it now. Most pumps will have some type of solid drive shaft that will just slide into place. Be sure to install this shaft in the right direction so that it'll be able to slide into the block all the way. Hold the shaft while you slip the pump into place and thread in any of your oil pump bolts. Popular opinion says not to use a gasket between the oil pump and the block. Sometimes gasket pieces can break off and get in the oil system. After you torque the oil pump bolt or bolts, check to make sure that the drive shaft is fitted into its slot in the pump, since the block is upside down right now.
Now, if you're sure that the rod bolts are set and all the internals are back in, let's button up the oil pan. Clean the block rail and the edge of the oil pan with some solvent. It's a good idea to touch a few dabs of gasket sealant at a few points along the block rail, just to help your gasket stay lined up over the bolt holes. Now you need to put dabs of silicone sealer at the 4 points where the rear main seal and the front timing cover seal arch up away from the block rail.
Now you can lay your block rail gaskets in place. If they don't fit perfectly in the corners, you might need to cut a few small pieces off with some scissors. If you don't have a one-piece oil pan seal like this, then you'll need to put the front timing cover seal on next. The manufacturers say that you don't need any sealer for rubber or cork style seals. Some gasket sets come with a few choices for the oil pan and front seals. Make sure that you pick the right size gasket from the kit that'll match your timing cover seal and oil pan. The same thing applies to the rear cap seal. Once you have the right one, press it firmly into place. If you have a cork rear cap seal, it's a good idea to coil up the gasket and then hold its shape together for a couple hours with a rubber band. This will give it a pre-curl, and the gasket will be easier to install and it won't want to bend upwards. With all types of engines, after the front and rear oil pan seals are in place, you should put another 4 dabs of silicone sealer in each of the corners where the oil pan will curve from the block rail to the arc of the front or rear seal. Now you can place the oil pan. Grab your oil pan bolts bin and start with the 4 corner bolts to give you a head start on lining up the rest of them. Thread in the rest of the bolts a few turns by hand. You might need to bang on the pan a little bit to get some of the bolts to start going into their holes, and make sure that you don't push the gasket inside the block. Now you can start seating them with a wrench. When they're all seated hand tight, you could switch to a torque wrench. These bolts are going to have a low torque rating, so hopefully your wrench will be accurate at that low setting. Work around the pan from the center bolts in a spiral outward to the front and rear bolts. If your engine has a thin gap between the oil pan and the timing cover like this, then it's a good idea to lay a thin bead of silicone sealer along that lip. Spread the silicone evenly with a finger and you'll be able to flip the engine back upright. And there you have it. Your short block is completely sealed and assembled.
Before you start putting the heads together, it's a good idea to prep a couple things. Get all your keepers together and put a little dab of grease inside each of them with a cotton swab. Then, if you're using any, do the same for any valve guide or umbrella seals. Make sure to wipe a little bit where the seal will contact the valve stem. Turn to your valve train organizer and pull the valves out one at a time and lube the valve stems with assembly lubricant. Remember, only do one at a time to keep them in order. Pay close attention to the order of the valves and the springs and retainers, but also double check to make sure that the valves are going into the correct head. Hopefully your identifying mark is still on at least one of these heads. If you're going to use the stock style metal oil shields, you'll have to have a set of 16 of these little O-rings to seal the valve stem. If you're going to use the standard style retainers like these, oil can drip through the springs all over the valve stem and slide right down the valve guide. To control this, a seal can be pressed onto the guide if your heads are machined to accept this kind of seal. Another way to keep too much oil from sliding down the guide is to slide an umbrella seal onto the valve stem. One of our motors used the stock mushroom type oil shields to keep most of the oil off of the valve stem, but it will need to have an O-ring to seal the drips that would come down past the retainer and keepers.
First, the shim and spring went on, and then the oil shield. Don't put the O-ring on yet. The retainer has to go on first, and the spring needs to be compressed as far as you can get it to go. Now you can get one of the O-rings and slip it onto the valve tip. It's going to want to stop and stay in the first groove, but that's where the keepers go. So you have to carefully slide it down into the second groove of the valve stem. A small flathead screwdriver will usually do pretty well, even if your spring won't compress very far like this one. When you're sure that the O-ring is fully seated in the second groove, you can install your keepers in the first groove and release the compressor. The retainer will pinch the O-ring against the keepers and the valve stem, and it'll keep oil from dripping directly down the valve guide. Another one of our motors had the regular style retainer with no oil shields. In this case, you need to install the umbrella seals first. If your heads have guide seals, there's usually a protector cap for the valve tip, and the seal can slide by the grooves without getting scratched. On even another motor, we just had to slide on the umbrellas and then fit a spring in the retainer. Rotate your springs a bit and make sure that they're sitting properly in their seat positions on the head. Now you can squeeze away with the valve spring compressor. If you need to jiggle the compressor to get the keepers to drop in, keep some pressure down on the fork so that it doesn't pop up and off the retainer. Your dabs of grease should hold the keepers in place to leave both your hands free to work the compressor. Be aware that new springs or springs with shims are going to feel a lot tighter than the first time around when you took it apart. Carry on down the line. If you have all your parts laid out in the right order, it'll be really easy to just do one right after the other. Of course, take your time and make double sure that the right valves are going into the right guides in the head. This is especially important if, for any reason, the valves didn't need to be reground and you're just going to be putting them back in the head, or maybe you're only replacing the valve stem seals. In this case, the valve faces need to match right back up with their correct valve seats, so they got to go right back where they came from. When they're all in, check to make sure that all the springs are seated correctly in the head. Then take a look at the gaps between the keepers at the valve tip. They should not be butted together on one side with a large gap on the other. They should be as evenly spaced as possible like this to distribute the holding tension more evenly on the valve tip.
Now that the cylinder heads are back together, you should clean the block deck surface with some lacquer thinner. Do the decks of the heads as well, then get all of the head bolts together from their bin to be prepared. If your head bolts go into holes that have solid bottoms to them, you only need to put engine oil on the threads and on the undersides of the heads of the bolts themselves. If any of your head bolts go into holes that extend into the water jacket, you absolutely have to put some non-hardening sealer, or better yet, some ARP thread sealer, onto the threads of the bolts to keep the water from leaking past the threads. Of course, they will need some oil or assembly lube on the underside of the bolt heads as well. Grab the head gaskets from your set and follow any labels printed or stamped on them. Gaskets with no labels can be placed with either side up, Just double check that for every hole in the block or heads, there's a hole in the gasket. Composition gaskets like these two don't get any sealant on either side, but a metal shim gasket gets an even coat of sealer sprayed on both sides of it with something like a high-tech spray-on gasket sealer.
Now you can gently lay your head on the alignment dowels of the block and start threading in the bolts. Pay close attention if you have a few different sizes of head bolts. Also, have the safety pin in the stand installed to keep the weight of one head from spinning the engine upside down until it's balanced out with the other head. Go through each bolt on the heads and make them hand tight with a wrench. Of course, we have to torque to the first of 3 increments and then reset the wrench. Keep in mind that most cylinder heads require that you torque these bolts in a certain sequence. Most heads have a similar sequence to this engine, and you should start from somewhere in the center and work your way in a spiral pattern to the outer bolts. If your engine has its own pattern, we might have it listed at boxwrench.net, or you could check in your repair manual. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of which bolts you did and didn't do. Just keep in mind how many total bolts you have and count as you go. When you get to what you think is your last bolt in the sequence, if your count is 1 short, then you'll know that you missed one. You should double check regardless, especially when you get to the final torquing spec. Once the heads are on, we can finish off the valve train.
If your motor uses rocker studs or push rod guide plates, you'll need to put them on now. Then get your valve train organizer tray close by. In almost every rebuild, the camshaft is replaced. If so, you'll have all new lifters and they can go in any order back into the block. The bottoms of the lifters that are going to ride on the camshaft should have the same moly lube that the cam lobes got. The sides just need oil or assembly lube, and the lifters can slide right in.
If you're reusing lifters from the organizer tray, they have to match back to the exact same cam lobes or they're going to wear out a lot quicker once the engine starts running again. The same goes for the push rods. The same end has to be facing up to keep them from having problems down the line. Before the rocker arms go back on, you should lubricate the cups of the lifter plungers where the push rods sit, as well as the tips of the push rods and the tips of the valves. This way, when the valve train's all back together, it's not going to be all bare metal rubbing on metal. You'll want to lubricate the rocker pivot balls as well before you pop them in. When the rocker nuts are finger tight, it'll be time to adjust the valve lash.
In the pre-assembly section, when it was time for the valve lash adjustment, we tightened the valve train to the point of 0 lash and then made the necessary inspections. For the final assembly of engines with hydraulic lifters, we need to adjust to 0 lash so that all the slack is taken out, and then we'll tighten the nuts down another half turn.
Once the lifters are installed, every time you rotate the engine, you're slowly wiping off the protective lubricant that you put on the cam lobes earlier. If we follow the firing order of the engine, we'll only have to rotate the cam 1 full turn to do the whole lash procedure. Here's how you set the starting point. As you rotate, look at the intake lifter or push rod of the number 1 cylinder. The exhaust will open first and then the intake. As soon as the intake returns to its lowered position, stop rotating. This will mean the cylinder is on its compression stroke and both lifters will be in their lowered positions.
If you have non-adjustable rockers, you can install both rocker nuts and tighten and torque them for the number 1 cylinder.
For adjustable type rockers, just like in the pre-assembly, spin the push rod as you tighten the rocker nut. It's kind of hard to tell the exact point where all the slack is gone and the push rod becomes just a little bit harder to spin. While you're turning your wrench and you feel that slight difference in resistance spinning the push rod, you should be at 0 lash and the push rod won't move up and down at all anymore. When you get close to 0 lash, it helps to hold your wrench up a little bit so that the socket is not sitting right on top of the pivot of the rocker arm. When you're absolutely sure that you're at 0 lash, set your wrench in a straight up and down orientation and then give the nut another half turn. What this does is pinch the plunger down inside the hydraulic lifter to set the preload. But when the engine is running and oil fills up inside the lifters, that preload on the lifter is going to be what keeps the valve train from making chattering noises.
If you're using hydraulic lifters that were run in an engine previously and have oil in them, you might notice that when you add the extra half turn, the valve might actually open a little bit. This is normal. and after a minute or two, if you had a gauge installed, you'd notice that the pressure that's built up inside the lifter will bleed off, and the valve will return to its closed position where it should be.
Your firing order will tell you which rocker to adjust next. On a V8 engine, whichever cylinder is next after the number 1 will already have the intake lifter in the up position. You'll just have to rotate the engine about a quarter turn and watch the intake lifter return to its bottom position. Now you can adjust the rockers for that cylinder. Then carry on through your firing order, and each time the next cylinder will have the intake lifter in the up position. When you've gone through all of your rockers, you'll only have rotated the camshaft once, and you should have plenty of break-in lube left on the rest of the cam lobes. Now that we have a completed long block assembly, let's think about the induction system.
It doesn't matter if you have a carburetor or fuel injection. The preparation of the block and heads is a pretty universal process. Of course, we'll start with some kind of solvent cleaner. Our favorite is lacquer thinner.
For most motors, it's a real good idea to put a teardrop-sized blob of silicone sealant in the 4 corners where the heads meet the block. Next, we put some gasket sealer around the water ports and their mating surfaces of the intake gaskets. When the sealer on the gaskets tack up, you can stick them in place, and then you'll be able to line up the bolt holes. When they're all lined up, you want to spread some more gasket sealer on the tops of the gaskets around the water ports. On any engine, if the decks of the heads and/or the block were cut, the heads will sit a little bit lower, and the gap here between the intake manifold and the block rail will be smaller. A lot of gasket sets have rubber or cork gaskets that will be too thick to allow the intake to seat down all the way. Don't use these gaskets. To seal the block rail to the intake, run a nice fat bead of silicone sealer along the front and rear upper rails of the block. Run that bead evenly all the way from gasket to gasket. We recommend that you do this for all engines, regardless of the decks being cut or not. It provides a much better seal between the intake and the block. When the block's all ready, double check that the oil splash guard is in place on the bottom of your intake manifold, if it has one, and then you can lower the intake in place.
Get some help if you need it. Cast iron manifolds are very heavy, and you want to lower it as close to position as you can. Hopefully, you'll only need to tap the manifold to get the bolt holes to line up. On most engines, the intake manifold bolts lead directly into the oil-soaked area under the valve covers. Treat the threads of these bolts with non-hardening sealer or some ARP thread sealer to avoid oil leaks.
As you snug up the bolts, on a lot of motors it's hard to get at the bolts that are near the plenum of the intake with a socket, so you just use the box end of a wrench. The intake bolts usually have a tightening sequence that's similar to the heads, but the sequence usually starts with the middle bolts that are near the plenum. Those are the ones that might be hard to get to. If you tighten one of the bolts that you can get to with a torque wrench at the first increment, then you put a box end wrench on that same bolt and feel how tight it is. Now you can kind of guesstimate how tight to make all those first few bolts in the sequence. You'll want to do this for the first few inaccessible bolts for each of the 3 increments. Now let's button up the engine externals, starting with the harmonic balancer.
If your balancer has scratches on the sealing surface, you can fix it with the repair sleeve. Also, if you know your motor won't be started for a few weeks or so, you should coat the sealing surface and the inner diameter with a white lithium grease. Regular grease will be fine though if that's all you have. Fit the balancer onto the nose of the crank and line it up with its keyway. For press-on style balancers, you really shouldn't hammer them onto the crank.
If you have a press-on style harmonic balancer, you're going to want to rent, borrow, or buy a harmonic balancer installing tool and thread it into the same threads as the center bolt on the crank. Draw up the installer nut and start turning. If it seems to bind up as it's going in, check it or pull it off and start again. You don't want to get it crooked and it end up pinching and then might snap off the tool in the nose of the crank. When it gets close or it's all the way in, the crank is going to want to start to spin. You could install your flex plate or your flywheel and disable the rotation of the crank to press it on for the last few millimeters, but you do run the risk of this happening.
That's not good.
That's what we get for buying a cheap tool the first time. The balancer could be in all the way, but later when it's time to line up all the pulleys and belts, then we'll know for sure. Let's move on to the fuel pump and clean its mounting surface. If you have one, lube up your fuel pump push rod and slide it up into the block. If you let go of it, it's going to want to slide right out. Just be aware of that until the pump is ready to go in. If you have a cover plate like this, gasket sealer goes on both sides of the plate gasket, then the plate with its holding bolts. Get some gasket sealer for both sides of the fuel pump gasket and some on its mounting point on the block. For most engines, when the balancer is set to top dead center for the number 1 cylinder, it's easier to install the fuel pump. Make sure that your push rod is up inside the block if you have one, and install the bolts and torque them to spec. Moving on to the front, grab your water pump and its gaskets and put plenty of gasket sealer on all the metal and the gasket surfaces. When it all dries a bit, the gaskets will stick right in place, and we can treat the water pump bolts with some type of thread sealer. This will keep the water from inside the block from leaking past the threads. If the bolts that hold your water pump thread into the water jacket area of the block, then you absolutely need to seal these threads. Next, all 4 of these treated bolts got tightened to the pump and torqued to spec. On the top of this motor, the thermostat mounting surface was a little bit pitted from some rust damage, so we just kind of smoothed it out and filled it in with some silicone. Then a little gasket sealer went on both sides of the water neck gasket. Pay attention, make sure that your thermostat is facing the right way before you torque the water neck down. Usually there's a label on them. This heater hose nipple didn't look like it was worth reusing, so a few bucks at the local auto parts store and we shouldn't have to worry about leaks here anymore.
Go through your notes and storage bins, and any of your miscellaneous engine externals should all make it back where they belong. When you get to the exhaust manifolds, you should prep the threads of these bolts with plenty of anti-seize lubricant. This is messy stuff, but it's absolutely necessary to keep these bolts from freezing up with all the heat abuse they get. These manifolds with the air injector tubes need to have the bolts first, then the gaskets before installing them. Sometimes you can thread the bolts in a few turns and then slip the gaskets in between the manifold and head, but only if you don't have exhaust emissions tubes like this.
Exhaust gaskets usually don't need any sealant, and any metallic finishes will face towards the manifolds. We finished sealing up our water system with the water temperature sending unit. Actually, one more thing to check in the water system is whether the pulleys are going to line up. Put the main pulley on the balancer and then hold the water pump pulley and belt in place to make sure that the pulleys are all lining up. If they don't line up, you could either have the wrong type of water pump if it's a new one, or the balancer might not be seated all the way on the crankshaft if that main pulley seems to be sticking out too far. If you want to keep the dust out of the upper valve train, then you can lay your valve covers on now, but don't tighten them yet. Now you want your engine to be off of the stand. We put our dolly wheels on so we could start thinking about rolling this motor out of the shop. You should put your motor mounts on if you're going to be sitting your engine on the floor to reinstall the flex plate and the center bolt.
Once your engine is out of the stand and sitting on dolly wheels or blocks, we need to seal off the rest of the oil system. If you haven't done it already, you can install the rear camshaft plug now that you have the engine stand adapter out of the way.
With these plugs, you don't want to smear sealant inside the hole in the block itself, and don't use RTV silicone to seal up this plug. You should spread a thin layer of non-hardening sealant on the actual edge of the plug itself. When you put the plug in place, you want to hammer the plug flush with the opening of the cam bore. The best way to do this is to use a bearing race driver or some similar oversized flat metal object. Just smack on the plug so that it sits in flush with the back of the cam bore. Then you can use a socket to tap in the plug slightly so that it's just inside the sealing lip of the bore. When it comes to the oil filter itself, you should lubricate the rubber seal of the filter with a little engine oil and spin it on just hand tight. Keep an eye out for oil gallery holes like this. There might be a few places around your block where an oil pressure gauge or an oil plug might go. Seal and plug up any of these holes that would let oil squirt out of them.
If you have the luxury of an extra oil pressure gauge, hook it up to one of the ports that lead to the oil gallery. If you haven't done it already, install your one-piece rear main seal to finish closing off the oil system. Now you can fill up your block with the engine oil of your choice. Just pour it right down the distributor hole. When the oil pan is filled, you'll need to slip an oil pump primer rod into the distributor hole. The primer rod will engage onto the oil pump drive rod, so you'll be able to spin the oil pump with a drill from the outside of the motor.
The drill that you hook up should be spinning in the same direction that the distributor will rotate as the engine is running. Your repair manual or the engine spec section at boxwrench.net can tell you which direction this is. If your drill is running backwards, you'll probably hear a bubbling noise from inside the pan, and you won't see any pressure on your oil gauge if you have one hooked up. If you do have an oil pressure gauge and you're spinning in the right direction, you'll notice that even at normal drill rotation speeds, the oil gauge will read plenty of pressure. It's a good idea right now to verify that your crankshaft is still at top dead center for the number 1 piston. Now you can run the drill and spin the oil pump. Run it for about 30 seconds to a minute and look at the rocker arms. When oil pressure builds inside the engine, oil will make it through the galleries and into the crankshaft and then finally into the lifters. After oil goes through the lifters, it'll move up the push rods and it'll start to drip out the holes that are in the rocker arms. You want to make sure that this happens for all of the rockers.
If you run the drill for a minute or two and a few of the rockers don't oil, you should rotate the crankshaft 1 full turn and run the drill again. This will change the positions of the lifters and should make it easier for the remaining lifters to oil. Since there are no valve covers installed right now, you should be aware that oil might want to spill out of the head when the rockers get full.
After all the rockers are receiving oil, rotate the crank to set the mark on the balancer at the recommended initial timing setting. This setting should be listed in your manual, or it might be under the hood of the car. Just be sure that when the marks line up that you're on the compression stroke and not on the exhaust stroke. Once the engine has been pre-lubed, you can grab the gaskets for your valve covers and install them. You shouldn't need any sealant for rubber style gaskets. If you have cork gaskets and you want to use some kind of sealer, you could spray one side of the gasket with high-tack aerosol gasket sealant and then stick the sealed side to the valve cover so that the gasket stays with the cover.
When you place them, just make sure that the gaskets contact the edges of the heads on all sides so that you don't have any oil leaks after the engine starts. The valve cover bolts don't have a very high torque rating. Usually it's best to only cinch these bolts up hand tight. With the oil pump primer out of the way, the distributor can go in its place. When you look at the distributor, you'll see that the rotor is connected to the distributor shaft. The distributor gear is also connected to that shaft. The gear in the distributor and the gear in the camshaft are both helical gears. When the distributor slides in place and the teeth of the distributor gear mesh with the camshaft gear, the rotor will move slightly as the helical gear teeth interlock.
In a perfect world, the slot in the distributor gear will engage the slot in the oil pump drive shaft, which is already fit into the oil pump. Usually this won't happen on the first try, which will mean the distributor may not seat all the way down flush with the block. This is because the oil pump drive rod might not be in the right position to perfectly line up with the bottom of the distributor gear. During pre-assembly, we rotated the oil pump drive rod by hand and the distributor dropped all the way down. Now that the oil pan's in our way, we're going to need to rotate the oil pump drive shaft by hand from the top of the engine. If you have one, the best thing to use is an oil pump primer rod. You can slip it into the distributor hole and move the oil pump drive rod a little bit. Only move it like a 1/16 of an inch at a time. Then give the distributor another try. If it won't drop down yet, pull it and rotate the drive rod a little bit more by hand and then try the distributor again. You want to hold the body of the distributor in the same position each time though.
Eventually the distributor gear will engage the cam gear. It will rotate slightly as it interlocks with the cam gear and slip right in place once it lines up with the oil pump drive shaft. Now your distributor should be fully seated flush with the block or intake manifold.
Now that the distributor's in, let's have a look at the rotor that's bolted to the top of the distributor shaft. The goal is to get the distributor to slip into place and have the rotor pointing maybe in the general direction of the number 1 piston. If your rotor tip is pointing in some other direction, the distributor is still installed correctly. You'll just need to make a mental note of where the distributor is pointing. We'll explain why later on. If you want to pull it again and try and get it to drop down flush and have the rotor pointing towards your number 1 cylinder, then go ahead, take your time. When you're happy with it, let's deal with the spark plug wires.
Before you install spark plug wires, your engine must be set to the initial timing setting recommended by the manufacturer. We'll use a simple method to set our engine to an approximate initial setting of 10 degrees.
If you have one of these top dead center whistles, you can screw it into the number 1 spark plug hole. Otherwise, you want to plug up the number 1 hole with your thumb and rotate the engine by hand. If the timing mark passes by and you don't feel or hear the air coming out, that means you just passed the exhaust stroke and you need to keep rotating. When you feel air rushing past your thumb or you hear it through the whistle, take a look at the timing mark on the balancer. Move the crank very slowly, and when the timing marks on the balancer and timing cover line up and read 10 degrees or whatever your initial timing is supposed to be, stop turning. Right now, your engine is paused at the exact moment in time where it's going to fire a spark from the distributor to the number 1 spark plug. Now we need to install our distributor cap. The cap will only fit on the distributor one way, and when it's on, the body of the distributor can still move left or right to make the sparks happen sooner or later as the engine is running. Since we're at the point of ignition for the number 1 plug, we want to line up one of the cap towers with the rotor tip. With the cap off, hold some type of pointer against the engine and point it directly at the rotor tip. Lower the cap in place and then line up one of the spark towers on the cap, doesn't matter which one, with the pointer by rotating it left or right. Whichever tower has the rotor lining up with it is going to need a label. This tower is now going to hold the number 1 plug wire and is going to be the starting point for the firing order sequence. Don't let the distributor move from here on out. Tighten the hold down clamp so that the distributor body is locked in place, and then tighten down the cap on the distributor.
This is a good time to pop in your spark plugs so we have something to plug the wires into. Check your engine specs for the plug gap rating and heat range. Don't forget to use a little bit of anti-seize lubricant on the threads and torque them to whatever your engine specs say.
Okay, we're looking good. The crank is positioned and the distributor rotor is parked at the moment of ignition for the number 1 cylinder. Now take a look at your firing order. Every firing order for every engine type starts with a number 1, and then the rest of the numbers in the sequence will follow the valve opening events of the camshaft. Your engine absolutely has to match this sequence or it's not going to run. You might have seen a diagram for your plug wires in your repair manual. These diagrams are just a representation and you don't have to follow them exactly. To correctly wire any distributor, all you need is 3 pieces of information. You'll need to know your cylinder numbering, the direction that your distributor rotates, and your engine's firing order. We already have the rotor inside the distributor set in place. Now, the firing order, as you read it from left to right, needs to happen in the same direction of rotation that your distributor turns. For example, on a lot of engines, including this one, the firing order starts with 1843, and the distributor rotates clockwise. On some other motors, the firing order could start with 1372, and the distributor might rotate counterclockwise. Whatever your engine specs say, this is how you'll know which way to wire up your distributor. The first one is easy. Right now we're at the moment of spark for number 1, so we connect the wire from the tower with the mark on it to the number 1 spark plug, and every time the rotor hits that point while it's spinning, then the spark will go to the number 1 cylinder as the engine runs. This distributor rotates clockwise, and the next number in the firing order is 8. So the next tower in the clockwise direction gets connected to the number 8 spark plug. Continue on through your specific firing order and do your best to try and judge the lengths of the wires as you go so that you don't have too much or not enough slack when you get to the last couple. This type of distributor has an ignition coil built right into the cap. Some engines have separate ignition coils. When you're all set, double check the order of the wires. Plug wiring mistakes are one of the most common causes of startup problems for new rebuilds. It's really easy to cross a wire or two if you're not paying attention, so take your time and check them over again and make sure that you're sure. When it all checks out, you can organize the wires a little with some kind of wire separators or maybe some looms.
Now it's time to take another look at your notes from disassembly. You want to build your engine back to the point it was at when it came out of the chassis. Some of you might even go as far as reinstalling your fuel injection system or your carburetor. From here on, all engines will need the flex plate or flywheel torqued in place. The same screwdriver technique from before will keep the crank from moving. Automatic transmission engines will only need the flex plate for now. For engines with a flywheel and clutch assembly, the clutch pressure plate and disc should be installed.
When the flywheel is torqued in place, you're going to need to set the friction disc to a centered position on the crank. You can get a plastic alignment tool that will center the disc where it needs to be while you fit the pressure plate on and tighten its screws. When the pressure plate is torqued onto the flywheel, the disc will be pinched into its position and it won't move anymore. Now you'd be able to pull out the alignment tool. That should take care of the rear area of any engine type. Now, for most engines, but not all of them, the torque rating for the center bolt is usually the highest in the whole engine. So make sure that you have the crank held still while you put the big old torque on this guy.
After the center bolt, it's going to be up to you to decide how much else you bolt on the engine. Just keep in mind that you might still need to roll the whole deal through a doorway or past some other obstacle to get it to the hoisting location. Hopefully your notes and newfound building skills have brought you to a completed assembly, ready for installation back in your vehicle.